Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. Now, there have been a lot of characters named Superwoman, and they all have a lot of things in common. For one thing, obviously, they all make pretty good Superman analogs. They all typically have powers that resemble Superman's, but aren't actually Kryptonians themselves. And they typically are shrouded in mystery, with the role almost being more important than the person playing it. And when it came time for DC Comics to introduce a proper Superwoman into the post-Crisis on Infinite Earths continuity, they paid homage to many of those trends. See, in the early 2000s, a new Superwoman was introduced in a storyline called Who is Superwoman? This character burst onto the scene in Supergirl's book and appeared to be Kryptonian. And this was a period in comics when that wasn't really that hard to believe, because this was a point in comics when Earth was suddenly flooded with Kryptonian survivors, refugees from their lost world. This was during the Jeff Johns, Richard Donner era of the property that sought to introduce lots of elements from the Bronze Age and from the Superman movies back into the comic book format. For example, Zod. So it should come as no surprise that the Superwoman introduced during this time had a lot of resemblances to Kristen Wells, the Bronze Age Superwoman. However, unlike Kristen, who served the greater good but was definitely completely above board, this Superwoman was apparently quite a bit more lethal. And while her powers definitely appear to be Kryptonian, she seemed to lack the weaknesses to kryptonite that a true Kryptonian would have. So when Supergirl confronted her about it, it turned out that this was Lucy Lane. Now, who is Lucy Lane, you might ask? Well, she's Lois's sister, and actually the oldest member of the Lane family that we were introduced to after Lois. You see, even though General Sam Lane has become a huge part of the Superman lore in modern times, he was actually introduced in the Man of Steel miniseries that launched the post-Crisis era. But Lucy is different. Lucy goes back to the 50s. She was introduced in Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen to create a romantic paramour for him to pursue, much as Superman had Lois. At the time, she was a flight attendant and had multiple suitors. Jimmy would try his best, but could never quite measure up to her standards. But writers clearly thought that they were meant to be together, and so often paired them in imaginary stories, such as in the tale of Superman Red and Superman Blue, where we see Lucy and Jimmy getting married alongside Superman and Lois and Lana in a triple wedding. She spent the Bronze Age as a recurring, albeit less important character, appearing every now and then, usually in stories involving either Jimmy or Lois, or both. For a long time, her only major on-screen adaptation was in the Supergirl film from the 80s, where she was played by Maureen Teefy. In that, she was Kara's roommate, as well as a love interest for Jimmy, who was way too old for her in that movie. After the Crisis on Infinite Earths story arc completely shuffled DC continuity, Lucy was reintroduced as a flight controller who had been blinded by some sort of chemical attack, possibly by terrorists, possibly instigated by Lex Luthor. When we are introduced to her, she is used as a stand-in for the blind girl from the original Bizarro story as they retell it, allowing a heroic moment where Bizarro gives his life to restore her sight. Following that, she would make random appearances throughout the 80s and 90s until she became a more permanent fixture when she started dating Ron Trope, who was another reporter at the Daily Planet. That relationship got really serious, resulting in an unexpected pregnancy that prompted the two to actually get married. But then we got to the 2000s era of DC Comics where, shall we say, a certain writer who had a lot of influence over the line just didn't seem to care about anything that had happened in DC Comics since the Bronze Age, and kind of just forgot that that whole relationship happened. So Ron was back working at the Daily Planet, Lucy was around, didn't seem to know each other, and this is where we catch up with the Superwoman story arc. Because apparently, Lucy, having almost lost her father at the end of the Our Worlds at War arc, and by that I mean he died but got better, well, she apparently had enrolled in the military and had worked her way up to being pretty high-ranking and useful as a guinea pig for some kind of science experiment. In this case, an experiment to create a suit through a combination of science and sorcery that would emulate the powers of a Kryptonian. Taking the guise Superwoman, Lucy was dispatched to take out dissidents and infiltrate the burgeoning Kryptonian movements. I need to be clear that this is not a good look for her. As political tensions worsened with the Kryptonians, Lucy had a couple of near-death experiences and was being held in Star Labs, where she had a falling out with her sister Lois one last time. And then Flashpoint happened, and the New 52, and nothing that I just said actually matters anymore. Lucy was reintroduced, just as Lois's sister, who was visiting Metropolis and dating Clark Kent for a little while, who was back to being single because a lot of things had been sort of reset and kind of reconfigured. Meanwhile, Lucy has become a much more popular character in other media. While my gold standard for Superman adaptations, the animated series, only showed her once as a child, and other than that just referred to her in passing when Lois wanted to complain about her sister, multiple actresses played the part on Lois and Clark: The New Adventures of Superman. Elizabeth Berandez and Roxana Zoll. We did get a version of her on Smallville, where she was played by Peyton List, and then much more prominently in the Arrowverse and then on Superman and Lois, Jenna Dewan played Lucy Lane, first as a romantic interest for James Olsen and a rival for Supergirl in the first season, and then more recently as a troubled family member, really testing the bonds of love with her sister Lois over on Superman and Lois. So while her time as Superwoman, as is the case with all Superwomen, was brief, Lucy Lane herself has been an enduring figure in comics, appearing since the 1950s, constantly being reinvented for each era as either a stand-in or a strong foil to her sister. And while her role as Superwoman was really a cop, and a narc at that, the design is really cool. It's clearly modeled after the Kristen Wells Superwoman design with cool updates. I love the hoodie, even if it is incredibly impractical, and I love a white cloak on a superhero, especially the Superman family. Her powers being derived from a suit also clearly resembles the Kristen Wells design, and the mix of science and sorcery that gave her powers could have opened up the door for tons of interesting stories if the timeline she was from hadn't been erased by the company-wide reboot. So as with the Bronze Age Superwoman that she is clearly inspired by, this Superwoman is most notable for the mystery surrounding her and her extremely striking outfit, even though the character under the mask actually has way more importance in the Superman mythos outside of that. But next time, we'll be talking about a character who, while she sometimes gets called Superwoman, more people know her better as Mrs. Superman. But until then, stay super, man. Hey, this is Case, just wanting to say thank you for watching the video. I am super tired because I have a newborn baby who is crying every night, and I am sorry that this means that the video is going up a bit late, but I want to thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a great week. Oh, and do the YouTube stuff, like, subscribe, all that stuff. That would be really helpful. Thank you. Yeah. Great week. See ya.